So I've been working on the Americas column at the Wall Street Journal since 1995. Over that period of time, now, sorry, I should tell you that the Americas was designed by Robert Bartley, one of our late great editors at the editorial page, because he felt that the region was undercovered. There wasn't enough news about the Americas outside of the United States. So my column covers Canada, Mexico, which of course is in North America. I'm always very disturbed to find out that many of my readers think Mexico is in South America. And then Central America, South America, and also the Caribbean. So that is what encompasses the Americas. And, you know, since 1995, when I took up the job, there was a lot of hope at that time that the region was on this path to development. That was around the time that Latin America was coming out of the 1980 debt crisis. So there was a big debt crisis in the 1980s. Most countries had to default and reschedule their debt. And there was an expectation that the region had learned its lesson about what creates development, what gets you into currency crises and debt crises, and basically impoverishes your country. And so there was a lot of optimism in the mid-90s. And I must say that looking back, I've been disappointed. But now that I'm 25 years older and wiser, I realize that I shouldn't have been disappointed. That is to say that I think my expectations were too high. And I want to first point to the work of the late economist, Nobel Prize winner Douglass North, who won the Nobel Prize in 1993 for his work on the importance of institutions. And institutions being important for economic development. So if you don't have the institutions, you really don't get the development. We know that institution building is kind of the long haul. I mean, you don't say, okay, I'm going to build these institutions overnight. It's the long haul. So it shouldn't be a surprise that when we have, you know, sudden popular support for, the fundamentals that we know are important to economic growth, this has not translated into prosperity. So again, go back to the mid-90s. There was a lot of support. There were politicians elected because they talked about more economic freedom and more and better economic policies for their countries. But the institutions were not there, and those institutions are still not there. Now, of course, there's 500 million people in Latin America. Most of them are poor. So if institutions are the way to help them reach a better living standard, you know, giving up is not an option. We have to continue to try to build those institutions. What I'd like to do today is connect the dots between, and this is very important, this is sort of the key element I think that I've figured out, and probably people much smarter than I already knew this, but it sort of evolved in my writing and in talking to people, is the connection between the norms and values of a society and of course the norms and values of a society are where the rule of law comes from. So the rule of law is what sort of underpins the institutions. And in order to have that rule of law, it depends on what the norms and values of the society are. And then that will tell you something about its capacity to create wealth. Now, before I do that, I just want to make a point about the discipline of political economy, which is a 19th century concept that I wish we could bring back. The idea is that you cannot separate politics from the economy. So we used to have a discipline called political economy, and now we have economics and we have political science. I think that's a mistake. And, you know, there are obviously graduate programs and so forth where you start to combine those things. But I think it's very important when we think about the intellectual firepower behind building institutions and so forth, we should be talking about political economy. When I first started writing the Americas column, I thought almost exclusively about economics. I studied trade theory, optimal tax rates, optimal currency areas, deficit spending, capital flows, you name it. I did all that economic stuff. But after a couple of decades, I came to realize that fundamentally, we already know what creates wealth. It's not like a hard question that we have to all go in a room and have conferences and you know, try to think, where does wealth come from? We know that societies that have low taxes, open markets, sound money, strong property rights, and a light regulatory touch with judicial certainty, those countries develop, those countries create wealth. In a nutshell, it's when people are free to work, to innovate, and importantly, to be able to enjoy the fruits of their labor, that we have development. The topics I cover in the column are basically politics, economics, and social matters. But when people ask me, you know, what's the column about? I usually tell them that what I write about is how societies organize themselves. What kind of rules do we have that, you know, what belongs to me, what belongs to you, what under no circumstances may I not take from you, what you can't take from me, not under, you know, emergencies situation or whatever, but what are the very hard and fast rules that define how we coexist? You know, no matter how libertarian you are, you need those rules to coexist. And societies that come up with the right mix of those rules, combination of maximum individual freedom, commensurate with responsibility and a high level of certainty, are the ones that do the best. This isn't rocket science. This is very well known and understood. And when societies are free, they're more prosperous. And even under those circumstances, the poor are less poor than they would otherwise be. So, you know, I think when I look at Latin America, I think about Haiti as one extreme. I mean, for whatever reason, and we can talk a lot about Haiti, you know, the society has not been able to organize itself. And if you look at the other end of the spectrum, you might see a country like, say, Chile, until recently, that now they're having a lot of problems. But, you know, they basically came up with a way to organize themselves with a constitution that allowed for a lot of innovation and investment, and that produced a lot of wealth. So Chile in 1973 was a very poor country, extremely poor, one of the poorest in the region. And now, of course, it's the most successful. We'll see what happens with the new constitution that they want to write. The big point here is that adopting the necessary rules, okay, I was just talking about these rules, some are better than others, and you get the results, economic results, from depending on whether you get good rules or not. But what's really, really important, what I want to really emphasize in this talk today, is that getting the right rules is not simply about plopping down a rule book on a country. And I think one of the best examples of that is Argentina, because in 1853, Argentina had some very classical liberal thinkers, intellectuals, who wrote a constitution. The 1853 Constitution in Argentina is almost a mirror image of the US Constitution. Very heavy on individual rights, on limiting the power of the state to take from individuals and the power of individuals to take from each other. So very much defending the rights of the individual. The U.S. Constitution of 1824 in Mexico is also very similar, was also very similar to the U.S. Constitution. Neither one of those constitutions stuck. I mean, both of those constitutions were thrown out eventually, and our Constitution was rewritten, which basically eroded those rights that I was just describing. So this is evidence that the rule of law grows out of the norms and values of the population. If the population does not value the tenets of a free and just society, no constitution, no rule book, that someone else brings in from the outside and says, use this rule book, this will help you develop. It won't work. It has to be organic. It has to be endemic. It has to be part of what the society believes in. And it has to be, I think what's really important is it has to be morally justified. If you give people a system that they don't believe is morally justified, even if it makes them better off, they will eventually destroy it. And I think this is an extremely important idea to remember when you're trying to basically be a leader in your own country, or thinking about why we have poverty in so many countries around the world, even though we know how to create wealth. So the question is not how does a country build institutions? The question is, why does a country build the right institutions? Because only if the why, and by that I mean, where does the demand come from to ask for a system that will protect individual rights? Where's that demand coming from? That demand is coming from the values of the population. And only if we understand that can we understand why some countries build institutions, lasting institutions, and of course develop. Now, I want to recommend a book to you, which I thought I had here, but I guess I forgot to bring with me. Oh, I see, it's upholding my computer, so I will not. But it's called In Defense of Liberal Democracy. It's by a Salvadoran economist named Manuel Hines. And it just came out this year. I think it came out in April. Hines is the economist who basically dollarized El Salvador in, I believe it was 2001. And he writes in English. He's really writing about the United States. He loves the United States, and he's lived in the United States. And the subtitle of the book is What to Do to Heal, what to heal the divisiveness that is in the country right now. Now, he's basically talking about the U.S., but the book has implications for the developing world, I think, because he gets into a discussion about the roots of liberal democracy in the U.S., and he contrasts it with our British forefathers and the values that drove development in England, and he compares that with France and Russia. And it's an extremely interesting set of comparisons, because what he finds is that institutional successes common to the US and Britain have their roots going back to the Magna Carta in value systems that put a high priority on the rights of people, on the rights of others. And that's a very important term, I would say, the rights of others. Basically, he fishes out, a lot of history from when the nobles challenged King John, and they were demanding that he, the king, recognize their God-given rights. Now, what's interesting is, okay, so that was when they wrote the Magna Carta. Many centuries later, the French had a revolution, which is often considered, some kind of, throwing off monarchy for democracy. But the French did not have the same experience. In other words, when people went and unseated the king, they didn't ask for the rights of others. And most of you probably already know that history. But because of the way the French Revolution unfolded, it explains why it only spawned more tyranny. Because if you are only asking to unseat the guy who's got the power at this time, but not asking for rights that defend your rights and all rights of others, of individuals, you will end up with just another series of tyrannies. There's a 2015 book, for those of you who are really interested in development economics, there's a 2015 book titled The Long Process of Development. It's by historian Jerry Hoff and economist Robin Grier. And Robin Grier has lived in Mexico. She's at Texas Tech. And they remind us that, institutions, we all talk about institutions. Oh, institutions are so important. But what these authors do is remind us that building these institutions took hundreds of years. Again, you don't plop it down. It takes hundreds of years. It's a kind of an evolutionary experience. Now, I'm not suggesting that all these countries in the world would take hundreds of years, because everything moves faster now because we have information. But I think it is important to understand that since institutions come from the value system of the population and cannot be just plopped down on a society, we should expect them to take a very long time to develop. And Paul Romer, who, most of you probably know that name, he's an important development economist. He tweeted about the book back in 2015, and his tweet was kind of funny. He said, why Gordon Brown was right to say, quote, in establishing the rule of law, the first 5 centuries are always the hardest. But that's sort of what the book is about, that you have to acknowledge that building these institutions will take a long time. And of course, I think, most of us have seen the efforts at nation building. That's hasn't been very successful, whether it's in Haiti or Afghanistan or Iraq. It's difficult because, again, the rule of law grows out of the values of the population. If the population if the ethics of the population is heavily built on, for example, envy, you won't have the right institutions evolving, because you'll have one group of people who insist that they're poor because the other people have what they don't have, and so forth. So, and this is an educational process. I mean, people have to understand the benefits of the recognition of rights for themselves, as well as the ethics of and the morality of defending the rights of others. Now, Hines, in Defense of Liberal Democracy, reminds us of the why. And I think this is why I like Manuel's book, because he asks the questions, why did Western European countries develop institutions while Russia lagged behind? I mean, Russia never really had the institutions. It went from sort of the Mongols to the czars, and from the czars to the communist tyranny. So while the czars were accumulating power in Western Europe, the smaller principalities in Western Europe were basically beginning to recognize the rights of entrepreneurs. And it happened early in Western Europe and in England, and it didn't happen in Russia, and it certainly has not happened in Latin America. And this gets to another point about natural resources, because if you go away with only one idea from my talk, I hope it is that a nation's natural resources that's something that we might call wealth, have very little to do with development. I mean, we see this over and over again. Japan, you know, just sort of a rock in the water, and yet was able to develop a lot of wealth when it incorporated the right institutions. I'm talking to you a lot about Latin America. I know for a lot of you, it's not a region maybe that you're that familiar with, but I'm going to try to bring some examples from Latin America that you might connect to just because it's been in the news. And also, I thought I would choose Venezuela because it's an oil state, and there are a few of those on your side of the globe as well. So it's kind of a good analogy or a good example of where you have a lot of natural resources, but you have a lot of poverty. And people have been asking really since maybe the last 10 years, what happened to Venezuela? Why did it go from being the wealthiest country in South America to a desperately poor country where there's no running water, hospitals don't have Band-Aids and aspirins and sheets, and you have to bring your own food, and they have almost no medical equipment that you would take for granted in a hospital. The electricity is broken down. There are often brownouts and blackouts, and just completely, you know, you have in Caracas a lot of high-rise buildings, and now the elevator service is completely unreliable. You have people walking up, you know, 10 and 20 flights of stairs to get to their apartments. And of course, there's been a huge emigration out of Venezuela. What I want to say about Venezuela is that it was a high-income country, but it was never a developed country. And that's a big difference. Now, there are Venezuelans who are going to take issue with that. They will say that Venezuela had roads and bridges and tunnels and factories, and it had this thriving oil industry. But Venezuela did not have the political economy institutions it needed to develop. And I believe that's because the society in Venezuela did not have the norms and values in the culture to support those elements that create prosperity, those economic elements, but they couldn't be supported because the population didn't believe in them. Low taxes, open markets, sound money, strong property rights, and a light regulatory touch with judicial certainty. There was really no intellectual support for those things. In fact, if you look back at what was written intellectually in Venezuela in the 70s, 80s, 90s, it was often hostile to the rights of individuals. The Venezuelan public did not buy into those things and believed that they were a fair way to organize their society. So what happened? Well, the good news is it took many decades to destroy Venezuela. But let me give you, and I know you've been listening for a long time, and I'm going to just finish with Venezuela, but I'm going to give you a short history of what happened, because you can connect the dots all the way through from the time in 1961 when they promulgated the Constitution all the way through to 1998 when Hugo Chavez was elected and began to impose this authoritarian socialism that has destroyed the country. In 1961, it was the dictatorship had ended in 58. They chased out the dictator. They had a transition period. And in 61, they promulgated a new constitution. The president, a guy by the name of Romulo Betancourt, immediately suspended Article 96. And, you know, I should say that Betancourt is often considered by Venezuelans a great champion of democracy. I mean, he stood up to Fidel Castro, and people think he was a great patriot in Venezuela. But I repeat, he suspended Article 96 of the Constitution almost on day one. And that article read, all can freely engage in the profitable activity of their choice, without any limitations other than those provided for in this Constitution and those established by law for security, health, and other reasons of social interest. So this was basically an article in the Constitution that allowed for economic freedom. Betancourt suspended it in 1961. It was a crucial protection for property rights. It remained on the shelf for 30 years. And a string of socialist governments were elected, employed price controls and exchange controls, all in the name of raising the living standards of the poor. Now, this may sound good to some people because, you know, basically what the government was saying was, okay, we don't have the resources to redistribute income. So what we're going to do is hold down prices so that everything is affordable, and we'll also raise labor rates. In other words, we'll mandate minimum wages. Rent control, and let me just, you know, I don't know if any of you have been to Caracas, but if you drive into Caracas, if you land at the airport in Maiquetía and you have to drive through on a highway with very big tunnels that go through the mountains to get into Caracas. And when you're on that road, there are hillsides going up and they are covered with slums. It's a really tragic picture that you get as you're driving into Caracas. And I mean, I've been going to Caracas since the late 80s, and it bothers anyone because you see people living very poor. And then you get into Caracas and you see gleaming high rises and so forth. I mean, I'm talking about before Chavez. So this is a good illustration of what happens when you don't have economic freedom. Rent control in Venezuela dates back to 1939, but it was not enforced by the dictator Pérez Jiménez. In August 1960, Betancourt, the president I just told you about, revived rent control. He passed a new rent control law and prohibitions on evictions. And if you can believe it, and this is pretty startling, not one rental building has been built in Venezuela since then. And, you know, if you're using common sense, it's common sense because you're going to build a building and you're not going to be able to collect rents in a way that pay for your investments. So why build the building? And that, by the way, is documented in a very good book for those of you who are economists interested in this topic of price controls. There's a wonderful book by a guy called Vladimir Chelminsky, Chelminski. It's a 2007 book called Venezuelan Society Checkmated. Now that I think about it, I'm not sure if it's in English, so you might check that. I know that he had an interest in getting it translated into English. I'm not sure if it was done. So you see these huge slums on the sides of the hillsides coming in from the airport. And I think it's very hard to deny that that is a testament to this socialist stupidity of rent controls and the prohibition on eviction. I mean, you need investors to build buildings. Otherwise, you're just not going to have the housing. If you put rent controls on price controls on rent, people will not build buildings. Housing will become more and more scarce, which is basically what happened. Now, there's a famous Venezuelan called Carlos Andrés Perez. He's often referred to as CAP, C-A-P. And he became the Venezuelan president in 1974. He was a big socialist. World oil prices had shot up very high, and partly because of Nixon's price controls in the US. Venezuelans suddenly in the 70s felt extremely rich. I mean, there was money everywhere. It was a big gusher. And here comes another big mistake. The National Assembly in Caracas, in Venezuela, granted Carlos Andrés Perez an enabling law. And this mistake has been made over and over in Venezuela. The enabling law allows the president to rule by decree. So rather than having three branches of government that jealously guard their powers and try to balance the power of the other branch, basically what you had in Venezuela was the Congress handing the power to the president with this enabling law. He used it to mandate salary increases. Okay, so Venezuela was rich. He declared everybody had to have a raise. And he put in place for the first time a minimum wage. He also froze prices, and he started to issue absolutely insane edicts. For example, all commercial buildings had to employ elevator operators. Now, in the 70s, we already had automated elevator. I mean, you know, you have elevator operators back in the 40s or the 30s, but by the 70s, elevators were already, you just push the button, you go. He declared that all commercial buildings had to have elevator operators, and all restrooms run for the public, so held by the private but that were for public, had to have attendance. So here he was mandating jobs. He also put limits on foreign investment in everything from telecom and banking to food and electricity distribution. He forced foreigners to sell what they owned in Venezuela. He nationalized oil in 1976. He expanded the role of the state in iron, steel, aluminum, and took control of coffee, cocoa, and the previously independent central bank. And with all of this, he was really on a tear, as you can see. He also ran up the national debt. Now, you know, a lot of times you'll hear people saying how terrible Hugo Chavez was because, you know, Venezuela became socialist. But you can see from what I'm describing to you that Venezuela was socialist going back easily to the 60s. And, you know, you can make arguments about Betancourt, but I think he had a very socialist leaning. But clearly in the 70s, it had a very socialist agenda. Now, when he ran up the national debt, he had a problem. The bolivar had been fixed at 4.3, between 4.3 and 4.5 to the dollar since the early 1960s. By the late 70s, the government was printing money to pay its bills, and the currency was no longer worth that. You know that if you print money, each note is worth less. If you're just printing money, you're just creating fake. There's no value in it. So the fixed exchange rate of 4.3 to 4.5 became overvalued. And let's see. So what the Venezuelans started to do was basically buy dollars with bolivars. It became a national pastime because it made them rich. The next president announced exchange controls. He reinforced price controls, and then he applied them to almost everything: cement, hotels, banking, parking lots, meat, milk, and sugar. Carlos Andrés Perez was reelected in 1989, and I see I'm running out of time, but he was an old-style politician. He was smart enough to realize he was out of options. He liberated prices, and of course, that was a big shock to the population. And he restored the article that Betancourt had put on the shelf for 30 years. There were lots of positive effects of that, but there was also pain. And when he ran into trouble, the population moved against him. There was another president who tried again to kind of liberate things. It was too difficult for Venezuelan society. They rejected him. And basically, we had the election of Hugo Chavez in 1998. I'm very close. I said I was only speak for a half an hour, and I'm over that. I'm happy to do a little bit more detail on Venezuela if you'd like, but I think that it's more interesting that we have a little bit of an exchange, question and answer. So why don't I stop here and open it to questions, and with the threat that if you don't ask questions, I'm going to start speaking again. So I really want you to ask questions. I think it's more interesting to have questions than to have someone talking at you, especially as it gets later in the day. So I had a little bit more I was going to say about Venezuela. We can talk about Argentina if anyone's interested in that. Mexico. Really, the whole region is open for questions. And I would just add that I am also on the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal. So I write sometimes about trade and about the dollar and about the Fed. So I'm happy to talk about the US or anything you want to talk about. I think this should be a fun session and very relaxed, and let me see if I can answer some questions. If not, I'll begin talking again.
Okay, Mary. So I think we all feel pretty relaxed and we'd like to have fun.
Okay.
So let me take the prerogative of answering the first question and maybe get a little bit abstract, if I may. I would ask you the following. One thing that I've been doing a lot of thinking about in recent years is what I think is very much a distinction between what we call economic freedom and political freedom. And you use this term political economy. And I think it's important to think about, certainly in this part of the world, in the Middle East, there's a lot of new things happening. And there's recent new, very interesting peace accords in the Middle East between Israel and the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. But I think the territory is very open in these countries for more economic freedom. But I do not think it's very open for the enthusiasm for a lot of the political institutions that they love so much in the West, democracy, etc. I think there's less enthusiasm for it. And in answering that question, I would ask you to maybe bring into the discussion what happened in Chile. Because Chile, I think, is a very interesting example, where essentially political freedom was obliterated for a period of time, and what was inserted was a tremendous new wave of economic freedom to transform the country, and then turned over to give more political freedom. And now, after a tremendous amount of success, there's forces there that are trying to ruin what was accomplished. So anyway, I know I've said a lot of stuff here, but I think I've given you some kernels to say some stuff about what all this means.
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. Let me try to tease it out a little bit. First of all, I think that this idea that there's political freedom and economic freedom, I'm a little bit skeptical about that. I mean, the political freedom is designed to ensure that I can protect my economic. Well, let me back up a little bit. I mean, I think the whole idea that, for example, if the fruits of my labor are not protected, but I get to go to the polls once every 4 years and check off for somebody, I don't consider that freedom. I mean, I think that, and this gets to a sort of philosophical debate about whether property is just something that's over there that has nothing to do with protecting me, or that property is like the fruits of my labor, what I have built, earned, innovated, created, are part of who I am, and that in as much as protecting my person, physically, say, it also is philosophically, what I would say is that those things that I created also are part of me. And so when I was talking earlier about rights and recognizing rights, what King John was forced to do, and later a lot of the principalities in Western Europe were forced to do, was to recognize that, you know, businesses, they were coming out of like what we call the Dark Ages, that those entrepreneurs, that what they had created, the wealth they made through trade and so forth, was part of them, and it needed to be protected. So I don't think you can separate rights like that. And so going to the question of, I mean, I would rather live, it's very unusual that would happen, but I would rather live under a dictator who doesn't allow me to vote, but protects my rights from the state and from others, because it's both that could threaten us. And I think that's the genius of the US Constitution, is that the rights of people are protected from the state and also protected from others. Now, you rarely have a situation where a dictator does that. And I think, and usually those dictators don't last, because as people acquire more economic power, and that's precisely what Manuel Heinz is describing when he says, why did the princes in Western Europe have to give rights to the population? Because as they acquired economic power, they acquired political power. And these princes recognized that it was in their best interest to have strong principalities. And to have strong principalities, they needed strong economies. But in return, he had to give them rights. So, for example, you have Pinochet, who, you know, the left loves to denounce because he had a dictatorship for 17 years. It denied people political rights. Free speech was limited, and there was no voting. But people had their economic rights. And so why did Pinochet only last 17 years and the Cuban dictatorship is still going on? Because as people gained economic power, it was dispersed in Chile, and that gave them political power, and then they were able to regain their political rights. But as I say, it's very unusual to have kind of a dictator figure who gives people their rights. I think, you know, Singapore is another example, but Singapore is really a city-state. It's not really I wouldn't call it really a country. You know, if someone told me that these countries in the Middle East were going to not give any political rights, but were going to ensure that people had their economic rights, individuals had their economic rights to protect them from the state and from each other, I would forecast that over time, those countries would evolve into you know, fully free countries. Let me just say one other thing about Chile, which goes to this point about values. I have a very good Chilean friend, political philosopher friend, who told me years ago, before any of this happened, he said, and I said this earlier in my talk, but I'll repeat it. He said, if you have a system in which, you know, the society does not believe that it's legitimate. In other words, the society, the Constitution does not grow out of the norms and values of the population. Even if they're made better off by that system, they will eventually destroy it. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing in Chile. You know, Pinochet put this constitution in place. Of course, he had a lot of backing from the right in Chile, but maybe the problem was that Chileans more broadly did not believe in this, and that it's a society that is based more on envy and resentment And that envy and resentment is what we're seeing sort of bubbling up now as they threaten to, you know, they're going to destroy this constitution and put in a new constitution, which will fundamentally make them not so much like Venezuela. I'm not sure they're going to become Venezuela, but I think that they, you know, their big aspiration is to become like Argentina. So again, this is a very, I mean, we're wrestling here with a question that is huge. I mean, Adam Smith in The Theory of Moral Sentiments gets at this. You know, people talk a lot about the wealth of nations, but I think Adam Smith was a philosopher. He was not an economist initially. He was a philosopher. And the ideas of the Scottish Enlightenment all go to this point. I mean, what I know for sure is that there's no recipe for this. There's a recipe for creating wealth, and that is low taxes, open markets, sound money, those things I mentioned before. There's no recipe for creating a culture that, you know, sort of discards or eschews things like envy and resentment and, you know, coveting thy neighbor's goods. And there's no recipe for that. If you have a society where people think that that's legitimate because, hey, that guy has more than I have, I think you're stuck. And how to get past that cultural, you know, I don't like to blame culture all the time, because I think if you blame culture, what you end up saying is, well, you know, you were born this or that, and so you can't get out of the problem. And I reject that. I think all societies can evolve. You know, Ireland, where my family came from, was an extremely poor country for a very long time. But I think they got out of it. I think they built institutions and they found ways to make themselves better off. I mean, we'll see the test of time if they hold on to it. But so far, they seem like they had the right elements culturally to do that. But that's a matter, that's why I was making the joke before that Gordon Brown said, when it comes to building democracies, the first 500 years are the toughest. I mean, these are not questions that are easy to answer. And they go to issues of religion and value systems, you know. Last summer, when there were the riots here in the US, I was really stunned and very disappointed when I heard people saying, first of all, that businesses that were destroyed, many, by the way, minority-owned businesses. West Philadelphia was really trashed. And those were, the owners there were Black and also immigrant. I remember reading about North Africans and who owned businesses there, and they were destroyed. And when people challenged those people who were kind of leading that unrest, they said, well, they're only buildings, you know, they don't really matter. Well, this goes to the point about whether the fruits of our labor are part of us. And I think they are. And that's not a materialistic view, like an you know, that's not I mean, I think as in terms of like being humanitarians and wanting to help the poor and doing philanthropy, I believe in all that. But the path to that is not through the state and the confiscation of property. And so I think that your ownership of your property as an extension of yourself is a very important philosophical issue that is either in a culture or it's not. And I think also that it can be nurtured and cultivated over time in universities and academics by intellectuals, and it can be destroyed in the other direction. And I'll just say one more thing before we move on, which is there's a very nice story by that was told by Alvaro Vargas Llosa, the son of Mario Vargas Llosa, in a book he wrote about socialism. I don't remember the book right now, but he tells a story of Emiliano Zapata. Zapata, of course, is famous because he was he fought against in Mexico, and he was an Indian, and you know. And people usually link his name to socialism. Zapatistas are the, you know, rebels in the south of the country and so forth. But Alvaro tells the story of Emiliano Zapata, who really was just fighting the Mexican government to get the lands of his ancestors back because he felt those lands had been taken away. So someone says to him, Emiliano, what do you think of communism? And he says, well, I don't know what communism is. Tell me what it is and I'll tell you what I think of it. So the guy says, well, everybody in the community grows crops during the year, and at the end of the year, at the harvest, all the crops are collected by one central source, brought to one place, and then the proceeds are distributed equally among the farmers. And Zapata supposedly said to him, let me tell you something. If someone disposes of the fruits of my labor in that way, I'd put a bullet through his head. So Emiliano Zapata was not a communist, and Emiliano Zapata believed that the fruits of labor should be kept by he who, grew the harvest. But we've lost all that. I mean, if you go into most Latin American study program in the US, you'll never hear that about Emiliano Zapata. You'll hear about socialism and the values that make socialism the right path. So I think that there's also a big job for in educating people about both the ethical and moral legitimacy of protecting individual rights, and obviously the more utilitarian results of a model that depends more on individual rights.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
My name is Shekel. I study computer science. Thank you for this great talk. Maybe it's a bit of a repetition or repeating what already been said, but I want to hear from you. You gave a very interesting hypothesis, which means that you cannot have shortcuts for democracy or for human rights. You need institutions that take hundreds of years to develop. So does that mean that this theory predicts that very recently successful countries like China, Singapore, maybe more recently UAE, will all be destroyed, like Chile maybe is being destroyed right now?
Well, first of all, I mean, I think that China, as successful as China has been, it has a long way to go before it could be considered a developed country. It's creating wealth. There's no question about that. But it doesn't have the institutions that are necessary, I think, for the long run. And of course, the long run could be very long. And by the way, let me separate China and Singapore, because I do think that Singapore, in as much as it's nice to use Singapore as an example, because they went from being extremely poor right after the war to being, pretty much a first world. I mean, it's an amazing place. It's very developed, but it's really a city state. It can deal, because it's so small. It can deal with things it has an easier time of it. So let's leave Singapore out. But I think another country that would be interesting to think about would be South Korea, because South Korea basically evolved under a dictatorship and then eventually became a democracy. I'm not saying that that model is impossible. What I'm saying is that, the jury would be out on South Korea because we don't know how deeply ingrained the values are that underpin the system that they have, and until they're tested, right? So I think what I'm trying to say is that if you plop down the rule book via a dictatorship, and eventually it evolves into a democracy, but you don't have the cultural underpinnings for really a free and just society, you know, it's very likely that it will come undone. And you know, another example that Manuel Heinz gives in his book is Germany in the 1930s, and he contrasts that with Britain, because he says, you know, a lot of times you read about either Hitler or Lenin, and you know, the message you get is, oh, what bad luck those societies had. You know, these bad, really evil demagogues came along and took control. And what Manuel is saying in his book is, that's not true. That it was the societies themselves that asked for that. They wanted that authoritarianism. And in the case of Germany, it was because they had all this poverty, you know, they had collapse, and they found the solution in going after this guy. So if you had a society that really valued what I'm talking about, which are recognizing the rights of others, that couldn't have happened. And he claims, and I will say that Manuel Heinz is a very big fan of the British. So, but he claims that in the contrast between the way different countries reacted to the Depression, you see the values of the society. And so in Russia, of course, you know, again, why did Lenin get the power that he got? Not because the Russians just had the bad luck that Lenin came along and he was an evil genius and he took power. No, it was because fundamentally at the ground level, there wasn't a value system in place that put a high price on recognizing the rights of the others and the rights of individuals. So that has to be, you know, somehow in the water. And China is sort of, I don't want to comment too much on China because I'm not a China expert. And when I look at it, it just looks like a really big problem because it's such a big country. The theory has been, up until now, there's been this theory that if you give people economic rights, then they will, they'll have something to lose, right? So they'll gain those rights, they'll want to protect those rights, they'll want to protect the resources that they've developed, and so they will want to have a system in place that protects those rights, which would be a modern liberal democracy. But I think what he's saying is that you can end up creating a lot of wealth, but not having a long-run stable system if you don't have the value system in place. And I would just say one other thing, which is that it's not that, you know, whether it's Chile or Germany in the 30s or, well, Russia never had it, but I would say that in the case of Germany, you know, in the 19th century, Germany had some values. So the other important point is that this is a battle that's never won. It's not like we got there and we're done. It is a constant battle. I mean, I think Milton Friedman made that point many years ago. I don't remember exactly how, but I have it in my head that he said something like that the case for freedom has to be made every generation. And and that's, by the way, why socialists tend to go into the universities, because they know that implanting these ideas in young people at a very early stage are part of the process they want of undermining those values. So in the case of Chile, I think that there was a high value put on individual freedom at one point, and people could see, okay, this is my path, and I want to protect this. But that was lost over time. And all countries, whether they're, you know, based on a high value of rights or not, they're going to be business cycles, right? I mean, the Hayekian idea of business cycles, the Austrian idea of business cycles exist. So you can't have a system, if you have a system in place that is only supported when the country's doing well, you're not going to make it. Because when you go through a rough time, the guys will come out with the pitchforks and the torches, and they'll want the head of everybody who has more than they have. And, you know, and I think that's sort of, you know, for some reason, you know, in Chile right now, I think you could make a case that there's disappointment in the rate of growth and so forth. Okay, there's disappointment in the rate of growth. So let's think about, why aren't we growing faster? What can we do? Instead, they say, let's burn the whole thing down. So that means that the fundamental, the foundation of what you have there has not been kept in good shape. And that's an ongoing intellectual task that those of us who believe in freedom have to continually renew. Otherwise, it's very easy, just because of our human nature, to, I think that's, I mean, I'm a Catholic, and we believe in the 7 deadly sins, right? And what we say, well, the reason we say those is because we know that's human nature. I mean, they kind of describe what is our human nature. And so we're always kind of battling. There's also 7 virtues. And we're always kind of battling those kind of, the parts of our nature that would make us hostile to one another. And that requires work on the part of educators and business community and so forth. And I think that that's a problem in the US right now. I think that we haven't done a very good job in getting people to understand why these rights are important. I don't know. Does that answer your question? I know I rambled for a while.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, Mary. First of all, thank you for a great talk. I'm Rita, and I have an economic question. I was wondering, what? Sorry. I study economics and political science at the Open University of Israel. I was wondering, what do you think about Trump's trade wars, and especially since you specialize in the Americas, about the revoking and replacement of NAFTA?
Okay, thank you for that question. Well, I was very much against Trump's trade wars. I wrote a lot about them. I would say, I would make a small distinction between China, actually a pretty big distinction, between China and his assault on the WTO and on the North American Free Trade Agreement. I mean, I think you can make a case that when China was brought into the WTO, it agreed to abide by the rules and so forth. And, you know, there's always this allegation that China has cheated. China is cheating. Now, I know in a strictly trade theory, if everybody else is a protectionist and you open your markets, you will be better off than anybody else. So free trade is about access to imports, which is more important than you know, trade agreements and so forth. And you'll always have mercantilist wing of, you know, in politics that is looking for export markets, and you should look for export markets. But the main beauty about free trade is importing, because you want to import the best priced goods from all over the world at and the highest quality and so forth. Because especially in today's economy, you're using those inputs to add value and either create something for your own country or to export. So, you know, just the very notion of like, you know, that a trade policy for a country should have quid pro quo, I reject. Chile, for example, opened its markets before it had any trade agreements with anybody. And that made it an extremely productive exporter, because it could buy things from all over the place, add value, and export. So I don't agree with the premise but I think that you could make the point, first of all, if they're using, for example, Uyghur slave labor, I think we should reject that. I think it's, you know, it might not be the best economically for us, but I think ethically it's important to take that stand. But moving away from China and talking more about North America, which is, you know, something that I know a lot more about, there was never any evidence that Mexico cheated, never. And whenever you ask Trump about that, he would start talking about China, but they could never say anything about Mexico because Mexico did not cheat. And Mexico is very important to this North American project where we basically put capital in the most competitive of the three countries and we are interconnected. And I think the proof that there was nothing Mexico was doing wrong and that Mexico is a good partner was in the fact that the USMCA, which is the new deal he came up with, really did not destroy NAFTA. I mean, he ended up pretty much, after all his assaults on the Mexicans, I mean, verbal assaults and so forth, he ended up with a trade agreement with North America. I think he was told by people, you know, look at the auto industry in the US is competitive globally because we manufacture certain parts of the car in Mexico and we have free trade with them. And in fact, you probably know this as a student, an economics student, there are things made in the US or made in Mexico, and then the parts of the car go back and forth more than once as they add value to them. So it was, and our relationship with Canada equally important. In the end, I was very unhappy that what they did was, I don't know how well you know the trade agreement, but they made a rule that some percentage has to be made has to be paid a certain wage. And I think if I recall correctly, it's like $17 an hour or something. So that was in effect, de facto, what that did was it mandated that 40% of the car would have to be made in the United States. And that was about protecting constituencies for Trump. You know, trade is always a very political problem. And if you haven't, I assume you've read Bastiat. Have you read Bastiat? Yeah. So Bastiat explains that, and you know, so does Adam Smith. It's a very political problem. So Trump was responding to people in the Midwest who who basically were looking for some protection of their employment because Mexico has become more and more competitive. Mexico was, you know, 30 years ago, it was basically like a maquila manufacturer, right? They would make textiles or something, but it's moved up. I mean, in the area of Querétaro, there's actually an aerospace hub of companies that make components for aerospace companies. So it's becoming more and more sophisticated. It's more of a competitor with the U.S., but it's also it cooperates with the U.S. So it's an important partner. And I totally rejected Trump's trade views. By the way, another interesting thing about Manuel Heinz's book is that he believes that if he identifies four sort of economic revolutions, and he says that in each case there is a political response. So he talks about the first industrial revolution, the second industrial revolution, the technological revolution, and the connectivity revolution, which he says we're in right now. And he draws a parallel between the second industrial revolution, which was basically the end of the 19th century, and he says that the disruptions caused by a revolution like that are what led to the unrest in Europe in the 1930s, which of course gave us Hitler and Mussolini so what he's saying there is that when there's a big economic disruption, it is often accompanied by a political disruption because people's ordinary lives are changed, and they can be changed dramatically. And so then they look for political solutions, and they often look for extreme people like Hitler or Lenin or Mussolini. And so what he's trying to say is that right now we're in this connectivity revolution, and this has changed a lot. And your question reminds me, because Trump supporters were also experiencing that, right? I mean, you don't have the big steel furnaces in the Midwest or in Western Pennsylvania that you had in the 1950s. So those people, their whole way of thinking, their way of life is changed. And through that transition is when it becomes more politically risky that people will ask for someone who's a crazy kind of authoritarian figure because they feel very off balance. And that's when it becomes extremely important that the population has a value system that says, okay, we're going through this, but we also believe in our heart of hearts that individuals have rights, and I can't infringe on the rights of others. And so your question about Trump reminded me of that, because I think that that's also something we have to keep in mind when we think about there's an economic disruption, how that relates to, you know, political upheaval and how to protect against that. That's, I think, maybe some of what we're going through in the US here right now.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Uriel Marislich. I'm a lawyer and an MBA student in Berlin. And I have a statement that it were unclear whether you will support it or not. So I'm just gonna call it and ask for your response.
Okay.
Can you say that if somewhat values are at different stage, like Germany at the time and so on, it's an optional for such leaders to grow and prosper there, but it can also go to different kind of leadership, but it's like, it's a different range. It's somewhat range that include Hitler and so on, but doesn't have to include that kind of leadership.
Okay, let me rephrase your question, because I think the sound is a little funny, so I'm not sure if I heard it. But you're saying that supposing someone believes more in a socialist kind of outcome, like, yeah, you own some things, but not everything you own is yours. I can take some of it. Couldn't that end in something like more of a soft socialism as opposed to something more extreme? Yeah. Okay, so I don't want to be religious or, you know, zealous about my idea of individual liberty. I think, you know, to be a purist or to be too, you know, extreme in any direction, it's not helpful, because we have to try to listen to other people, understand their concerns and so forth. So I want to say that when I hear someone who calls themselves like a social democrat, I'm open. Okay, I understand. And what are their concerns? There are concerns that this guy over here has nothing to eat and this guy over here has caviar. So therefore, shouldn't we do something about that? So I'm marginally sympathetic to that. And I also want to be, I mean, I think one of the things that's really scary to me right now is the lack of tolerance that is being circulated in the air. You know, this idea that, you know, that young people have, that they're so committed to their ideas that they're completely intolerant of the other idea, and that if you're saying something that I don't agree with, you have to be shut down. So tolerance, including tolerance on my part for someone who believes in more social democracy. I think that's really, really important, particularly in the dialogue. I mean, if in the end I say, okay, I do not agree with you, that's fine. But at least in the dialogue, we have to be open to hearing, the other side. I think the reason why I end up saying that I reject this idea of social democracy is twofold. One is that I'm not saying that I don't believe that I have somewhat of an obligation to care for people who are weaker than I am. I think I believe that. I think in my own sense of ethics and my own value system is that if there's someone who's weaker and can't care for themselves, I have an obligation to take care of them. There are many libertarians who don't believe that. They think I have no obligation. But it's quite different from me feeling that and me trying to impose that on another person, because everybody will have a different line. What ends up happening is that the politician believes you have too much and have to give it to somebody else. So I'm extremely skeptical about the state as the arbiter and the ruler in terms of dividing up wealth in a country. And also, I think that the evidence shows that the freer a society is, the more wealth is created and the more philanthropy we end up having. In other words, when you have a system like Hugo Chavez was going to cure poverty in Venezuela by taking from everyone, and then the state was going to somehow redistribute it. That's not a philosophical argument I'm making. That is just pure empirical evidence. Everywhere it's been tried, it's disaster. So you may say, well, maybe you don't take everything. Maybe you only take a third, which is basically what we do here in the United States. And I think it was Oliver Wendell Holmes that said, taxes are the price you pay for living in a civilized society or something like that. But what I want to emphasize here is not whether we decide to have sort of a more whether we decide to have a welfare state or not. What I want to emphasize is the rights of an individual to be protected from the state and from other individuals. And I think we should start there. I mean, if at some point we have a political system where we say, okay, you have so much wealth, you have to give up 25% of it for the good of society. We can debate that, but we shouldn't ever, ever, ever be debating whether an individual has those recognized rights. I mean, you can think of examples where societies said, get them, those ones over there, scapegoating groups of people. That is a society that doesn't recognize the rights of individuals, that says this individual. I mean, we're going through that here right now. There's some kind of in critical race theory, there's some kind of a suggestion that depending on your skin color, you have more rights or less rights. That's completely wrong. I think we have to be really against that. And again, I'm not suggesting name calling or, trying to destroy people who are more on the social democrat side. But I think our job, if we're going to be leaders, is to ensure that those basic rights are recognized across the political spectrum. And then from there, we can say, okay, well, we want a policy where we can help, say, the people who are born with handicaps that can't work for themselves. Okay, fine. But within that system has to be acknowledged the rights of the other. And the other cannot lose their rights, either because they're in a certain religious group, or because they're in a certain ethnic group, or because they're in a certain wealth group. If you go down that path, it ends in disaster. I'm convinced of it. I mean, you can go through all of history. It ends in disaster. So that's the point that I think has to be. And, you know, in the US Constitution, rights, individual rights are very firmly implanted. And you have judges and courts that continue to uphold those rights. And that, I think, that's different than tax policy, right? I mean, the government can pass a tax policy where they tax, you know, Biden can raise capital gains taxes to 50%. But an individual's rights to be treated, you know, equally under the law can never be violated. And those are violated in these societies that I'm describing. And it's very destructive for everyone. I don't know. Does that make sense to you? Is that an adequate answer?
Oh, yes, it does, and thank you very much.
Okay.
Mary, I know it's a tough answer. I think we have 3 or 4 more questions, and there's 6 minutes left. So if you can try to go through it quickly, I'll appreciate it. If not, we'll have to stop in the middle. All right.
Okay, well, you can see I don't give short answers.
Hi, I'm War. I'm a master's student in bioinformatics. First, thanks for speaking with us. Secondly, I think one of the most interesting countries in the Americas in terms of political economic landscape is Cuba, and they've also been in the news recently. I'd be glad to get your 2 cents about how come the model there has been sustained for the past few decades, and if it is sustainable going forward.
Sorry, can you just repeat the first part of that question? What has changed?
I was saying that I think one of the most interesting countries in terms of the political
That
economic.
part I got, but I didn't get the question.
Well, I'd be glad to hear your opinion on how come it's been sustained, the model there, for the past few decades, and what will happen going forwards.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'll try to be brief because, yeah, I have 5 minutes and 3 questions. So basically, it's sustained because of repression. I think when the island is actually opened up, people are going to be stunned at the level of repression. You know, tourists are taken there. They see a sort of Potemkin village. The repression is quite severe. And I recommend a book to you if you would like to learn about the repression. It's called Close But No Cigar. It's by a British investor who went to Cuba to work with the Cubans to build hotels and golf courses and so forth, and fell out of favor with the regime. And it's the story of his 18 months. In 8 months in Villa Marista, which is one of the most horrific dungeons in the world, and then another 10 months at a different prison. The other way that it's been sustained, of course, is it's a big mooch off of the rest of the world. So it relied on the Soviet Union. And then in 1994, it opened to tourism. So it got hard dollars, mostly from Europeans who wanted to go on cheap vacations and use slave labor. By the way, foreign companies that are in Cuba cannot pay their employees. They have to give the hard currency to the regime, and the regime gives worthless pesos to the employees. So it's a very unjust labor environment. And then in 1998, of course, you had Hugo Chavez elected, and you had an oil flow until 2014. And even since then, Venezuela has been given oil and so forth, diesel to Cuba. So the second part of your question is, what's going to happen in the future? I mean, I think the most important thing about Cuba that I see happening right now is that the narrative has been completely destroyed. I mean, I said in my column on Monday that Cuba's really good at 2 things: repression and propaganda. And the propaganda is amazing. I mean, if you, I've been listening to it for years, people talking about Michael Moore's film about how wonderful the healthcare was. And I mean, It was really hilarious if you know anything about Cuba. But that propaganda effort was very effective. And they had agents everywhere. They have spies everywhere. They're a very nasty group of people who enjoy this tyranny on an island, which makes it much tougher to, rebel. But I do think that the narrative, the image of the regime is over. And, Fidel is dead, Raul is almost dead. And I think that there's a new generation of Cubans that will ask for freedom. Now, whether Cuba has the value system to defend the rights of the individual, I think is a very hard question. And I'm not that optimistic that it will go from being, a poor, isolated, I'm not that optimistic that it will suddenly convert to democracy very easily. I think it's going to have a lot of problems. But I think even if you had something where there was free speech and respect for property rights, you could get a fairly rapid improvement.
Thanks.
Hello. I was wondering, my name is Max. I'm a law and business student in Hebrew University. I was wondering, how does the fact that it seems that many of the governments in South and Central America are corrupt, how does this influence and what is the balance of corruption in regard to freedoms and rights in the prospect of free market?
Yeah, okay, thank you. Well, of course, corruption, a big part of corruption is fighting corruption is institution building, right? So, demanding transparency and accountability is the way that you sort of chip away at corruption. I would say that it's a big problem. The left uses it to get power, and then Hugo Chavez basically was elected because he was complaining about corruption. So it's been the narrative of the authoritarians for a long time. I will say that the US war on drugs, I think, has made this very much worse. And it's almost, sometimes I feel like it's an insurmountable problem because you have a huge demand for these illegal drugs in the US. By definition, that money goes into the pockets of criminals, organized crime. And they use it to basically either intimidate or bribe officials. And in Spanish, there's an expression that says plomo o plata, which means, would you like lead or silver? In other words, either you're going to be shot or you're going to be bribed. And which would you like? So there's a lot of corruption from organized crime, which of course undermines institutions, undermines courts and so forth. And I think that that's something that the US needs to, really contemplate, because I don't see how you get out of the problem. I don't see how you build institutions when you have that problem of so much, billions of dollars going into these poor countries every year from American drug users and European drug users, I should add.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, Barry, it was great. I'm glad we could finally get you. And I thought I would share with you one anecdote of what I thought was a very profound insight from a guy we both know, Ed Crane.
Oh.
So Ed Crane was the founder of the Cato Institute, the president for many years, who I worked with for a good number of years. And he's someone who never had any particular interest in Israel. And one day he came to me and he said, I'm going to the Holocaust Museum. So I thought, I'm going to be interested to hear what I hear from Ed Crane about what he learned at the Holocaust Museum. And the next day he came back and he said to me something extremely insightful and profound. That the one critical date that's associated with the beginning of the Holocaust was Kristallnacht, which was the day in 1938 when they went through and they destroyed and smashed Jewish stores. it said to me, it all began when they lost regard for property rights. And I think that's extremely profound insight, and I think consistent with what you're saying.
Yeah, and I would say, you know, not just property rights, but like sort of carving out one group. In other words, some people had them, some people, I mean, that idea of scapegoating groups, I think, is also just,
Yes.
I mean, it shows that that value of recognizing the right of the other just wasn't there. I mean, you know, and when they came into this economic uncertainty, that's how they responded. So I think that's what we as educators, I mean, just as people, like teaching our children or anybody, that's what we have to defend in society, and also always nurture and cultivate. And let me just, can I just say something to the group, which is to say thank you for listening to me. I'm sorry that I ramble sometimes. I have so many things I want to tell you. But I hope, I mean, I've never been to Israel. I really want to go someday, but I just don't want to go for 3 days. I insist I only go for 2 weeks minimum. And I never seem to have that much time. So I haven't been, but one day I hope to go. But thank you very much. It was fun to talk to you, and I appreciate your questions.
We look forward to having you here.
Excuse me?
Look forward to having you here.
Muchas gracias. Adiós.
Okay.